Hello, my name is Tessa and welcome to another watercolour tutorial video. This time we're going to be going over some more basic watercolour techniques, 5 techniques really, starting with dry brushing, then layering, which we'll use in most paintings, splatters, which I use all the time, there's a couple of ways of doing them, and finally drips, which I'm just going to talk about how you can sort of control the water. We will then look at some wet on wet, and I'll try and make this into a bit more of a complete painting rather than just an explanation of techniques. For this, you're going to need a number of brushes. It's good to try these with different types of brush, but anything will do really. And of course your watercolour paints. I'm using Winsor & Newton. And then you will also need 2 pots of water, one clean for one dirty, and a rag to dry your brush on. As always, if you don't already, please take a look at my socials below. I also have a link to my shop where you can buy prints and stuff like that. So yeah, thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you don't already, please consider subscribing to my channel. And now let's jump right into our first technique, dry brushing. So for this, you're going to want a brush that has been wetted and then dried off. You don't want it completely dry, I find, it doesn't work super well, but you don't want much water on there at all. We're then going to start by picking up some paint on our palette. I'm going to go with a blue. So you will notice that there is a little bit of water on here, that's just to kind of activate the paints, but I will probably end up drying this off. So you'll notice here that the beginning of the stroke is quite wet, but at the end we have this drier section, and that is the effect we're going for. It's kind of a streaky look. So what I'm going to do is dry off the brush and try again. And now when I'm doing dry brushing, I do quite like to use the side of the brush rather than the tip. I find it creates more of a rough texture, which is normally what I'm trying to achieve with this sort of technique. And you'll see here at the end, this is where we're getting those dry, feathery looking strokes. So what I'm going to do is just dry off my brush a little bit more, pick up some more paint and give it another go. With this technique, it is important to control how much paint you're picking up, and that is kind of a function of the brush you're using and how much water. Now with this technique, it is important to experiment with the amount of water in your brush, because that will really affect the final results. And one thing I do like to do with this technique is using not a favourite brush, basically splay the ends so you get individual lines. And I think this can give a really cool effect. It can be useful for stuff like grass, where you might want uniform lines, but that aren't super controlled. So again here I'm using the side of the brush because it gives it a much more varied texture, and I think that's one of the best qualities of dry brushing. Moving swiftly on to layering. Now layering is something you're going to use in almost all of your watercolour paintings if there's any form of wet on dry technique. So for this I'm going to start with just a block of colour, and I'm going to demonstrate what will happen if I don't wait for it to dry. So effectively this is wet on wet. And you'll see as the red mixes in with the blue, you get this purple kind of colour mixing in the middle. And now wet on wet is a technique I use all the time and is a very valid and almost the characteristic technique of watercolour, but it's not always what we want. It will kind of wash out. Whereas see here, we've waited for it to dry, and now going over with the red, we get this really vibrant section in the middle, which is a lot darker, because the way watercolour works to build deep colours is you have to build up layers. And layers will create that depth and extra darkness. And you'll see here as I add the next step of blue, this middle section, that is the darkest patch, and that's because it's got the most layers of colour on it. So layering really is a crucial technique for watercolour because it's what allows you to get those deeper, darker colours. For example, if you're painting shadows or something like that. So it's definitely something to play around with to work out how dry the paint needs to be, how different colours work with each other and stuff like that to achieve the effect you're looking for. So while dry brushing and layering are quite predictable techniques, next up we have splatters. And for this I'm going to use a variety of brushes, however I'm going to start with my round brush. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to load it with water. You want your brush to be really quite wet for this to work well. And then I'm going to dump into the paint, pick up a load of pigment. And you'll see here, if I bring it across my fingers, there is a lot of water on that. And that's, for me, the best way of creating splatters that work for the paintings I'm creating. So the first splatter technique I'm going to show you is the one I use almost all of the time. It creates a slightly more chaotic and heterogeneous kind of look. And this is effectively holding the brush high above the paper and throwing it down. And you'll notice that I get a good variety of large and small splatters, and you also get some directional stuff, but generally it's quite chaotic. And you can overlay different colours in this, so for here I've put the red over the blue, and that can form quite a nice texture and a bit of variation in your splatters. So the next splatter technique I want to talk about is flicking, and this is not something I use that often, but it's useful for creating small and also directional splatters. So what you're going to do is take the tip of your finger and just run it against the end of the brush, and it will create these quite small and also directional splatters. So this is useful, for example, I do it if I'm using like blood sprays or something like that, but it effectively creates quite a fine splatter. It can be useful for freckles and stuff like that. Now I'm going to switch to a different brush to kind of just show you how things will change using a different brush type. So this is now a mop brush, so it holds a lot more water, and that will change sort of how dilute the splatters are. Here I'm also doing it quite a lot closer to the page, so while I'm doing the same technique as the beginning, you'll notice it's slightly more directional because I'm closer to the page and it has less time to spread out. Another thing you can do, especially with these bigger mop type brushes, is you can hold the brush directly above the page and just squeeze the water out. And this will create really big and dilute drops. And again here, I'm just showing you how you can create directional splatter with the mop brush. And these are slightly bigger drops. This is kind of more what I would do in my paintings than the smaller ones. But it's just fun to play around with and see what type of effects you can create. Moving on to another thing that I use in most of my paintings is drips. So for this, similarly kind of to the splatters, you're going to start with a really water and pigment saturated brush. And for the purpose of this, I'm just going to draw it on the flat and then show you how I'd create a drop from that. But often it's not quite as controlled as this, because often I'll just kind of tip the page up and see where the drops form. So what you're going to do is you're going to load your paint and your water onto the paper, and then tip it and begin to load more and more water until it creates a drip. And you can force that by dragging the paint down. So if you give it kind of a path, it will start to follow that. But if you wanted, you could just load lots of water and it will eventually choose where it wants to fall. Depends how controlled you're going for. One other thing that can be quite fun to do with drips is to load multiple colours into them. So for example, here with this blue one, what I'm going to do is then add red on top. And I can sort of control where it falls down the drips by tilting the paper. And that can create a really nice like double effect. So you see here, it gets halfway down the drip, and then as soon as I lie the paper back, gravity's no longer pulling the water down, and I can stop it from travelling. It is worth noting with drips that they can react quite differently on different paper types. So this is a cold pressed cellulose paper, which is quite smooth to the touch. Not in terms of texture, but in terms of the way the water grips, so you tend to get quite uniform drips. However, I find that on cotton papers, they're slightly more rugged, which might be what you're going for, but just bear that in mind and try with whatever paper types you're using. And finally, we are onto wet on wet. Now, I covered this in my previous tutorial, but I wanted to go into a little bit more depth here and create more of a scene to show you how you can use it in your paintings. So for this, I'm going to plan to do kind of a sunset sky scene. So we're going to have probably orange at the bottom, pinks in the middle, blues at the top. And then I'll try and create a scene using some of the other techniques. I might not show the whole thing in detail here though, but I will definitely do a whole video just on wet. So starting here, I'm going to be using my orange with the mop brush. So it's holding a lot of water, which will really help exaggerate this technique. And the first stage is just going to be to kind of block in the colours, work out where I want things, and then I can go back in and refine things whilst it's still wet, and then eventually once it's dry. One of the benefits of a wet on wet technique, and why I love it so much, is you get a lot of these really like organic, natural blending moments between different colours. And I think that's why watercolour is such a unique medium, is that others don't really do this. And I think it really brings watercolour into its own. As much as you can definitely do tight technical details, wet on wet is definitely, I think, the thing that draws a lot of people to watercolour, but equally a lot of people are kind of scared by it. And there's really no need to be, it's just that you've got to kind of let the water do its own thing. Don't try and fight it a lot of the time. So at this stage, I've got my main colours down. We've got a orange into a yellow, into a pink, into a kind of purpley blue, and then finally a slightly deeper blue that will go across the top. And then now I'm starting to add in some of my details. Now I know I want this to be a sunset scene, so I'm going to do some clouds. And to really make the most of the wet on wet technique, I'm going to add these in whilst it is wet rather than trying to add them in over the top as layers, because that will really kind of enhance the looseness and the organic natural feel. I'm also going to utilise lifting quite a lot in this, which is something I covered in my previous tutorial video. At this stage, I was really not sure how it was going to turn out. I quite liked it, but also these little blue splodges from when I was doing the splatters, which another reason why they're really unpredictable, kind of ruined it, and I kind of made plans to cover it up. But with wet on wet, there is often quite a lot of trust the process involved. It's really hard to predict what's going to happen because the water has a mind of its own. At this stage, as I was adding the darker blue, I did notice I'd let the paper dry too much. I'd focused a little bit too much on details at the bottom, but that's all right. I can always add more water over the top and let it blend into the slightly wetter sections at the bottom. You just got to work with the water rather than against it. At this stage, the paper has dried a little bit, still not completely, so there's still definitely some degree of blending, but I can start to add in more details. And then here I'm just going back in and lifting colour to cut out that shape of the clouds. Now I've skipped ahead a little bit here because I wanted to kind of get into the final details and not make this video too long. But essentially all I did was I added some more blue at the top, I added some blooms, which again I covered in my last video, and finally I'm adding the sense of a foreground. So this is still wet on wet because the orange is still not completely dry, but I wanted to incorporate some dry brushing as well, and eventually some proper layering and maybe a little bit of pen at the end, just to finish everything off. And this is the final result. So I did add some splatters on the top with white gouache, as well as dry brushing at the bottom, which I think always looks really nice as a foreground in landscapes. And I'm pretty happy with how this turned out, considering I don't really paint landscapes very often. And my personal favourite part of this painting is the bottom section, the dry brushing into the wet on wet. I think it just looks really cool. And that is it. These are 5 watercolour techniques that you can practice, experiment with, and work out how to incorporate into your own paintings. I have made this quite a whistle-stop tour because I know that I can't pay attention to long videos, so please do let me know in the comments whether you like this sort of video, whether you like more in-depth on certain techniques, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully see you again in the future for another video.